qualitative UX research methods. We'll cover some of the most common methods used, how to conduct them, when to conduct them, how to analyze them, pros and cons, and then show you examples of some of these methods in action. We're going deep. Zooming out, I want you to know that you'll likely come across hundreds of different research methods with different names, like discourse analysis, content analysis, cultural probes, Pictive, whatever. For an overview, you can check out designresearchtechniques.com. And wow, if you look at it, look at all those methods. Scary, right? How the hell are we supposed to learn all of them? Don't worry, I assure you that once you learn the core fundamentals, you start to recognize that all of the other ones are just some variation of the core method. Not all of them, but most of them. That's both a good thing and a bad thing. Good, because the fact that there are variations mean that you can get creative and adapt methods to fit your specific research needs. And that's the part I love about challenging research, because maybe you don't have the budget to run it the way you're supposed to. Or maybe you have the Gucci money and you want to try out crazy ideas like strapping body cameras to participants. The bad, well, I've been in your shoes, trying to learn UX research, and people write articles calling the same things different names. It was frustrating. So that's why in this module, we'll go over the common core methods in user research, so you don't have to struggle during the learning process like I did. All right, enough jibber jabber. Let's get started with some research methods. I remember seeing an old photo from the 1970s. Two men standing next to a fax machine, one of those big printers, you know? And they tried for a while, but couldn't figure out how to make it work. And if you were that fax machine company, you might have assumed that these two guys are just dumb. Now, we know better than to blame users. Remember our story from Module 2 about how Boeing B-17 pilots were blamed for crashing the planes? Yeah, don't blame users. Well, in fact, those two men fumbling around with the printer and fax machine were actually two really smart engineers from IBM. And I don't know about you, but even today, I still can't figure out how to use one of those things. I find it hilarious and sad because in the office, I lost count how many times I see the same person walking to and from the machine. I used to sit next to it. It was pretty noisy and I would see people like, how do you work this thing? If anyone has figured out how to use one of those, please help. Thanks. We learned in Module 4 how to plan for research, which includes aligning with our team on objectives and planning and getting feedback on your study plan. Always keeps those steps in mind. Those are always step 0. In this section of Module 7, we'll learn specifically about usability testing, what it entails, different types of usability tests, its pros and cons, how to write tasks, and different ways you can conduct it. It was my bread and butter when I first started out. I've done at least 1,000 of them. Yes, more than 1,000 usability tests. Probably 2,000. I've lost count, but I know it's in the thousands, or at least 1,000. It's like the pull-up, the gateway to other body weight exercises. You've got to master the pull-up before you can do other things. And that's like usability testing. It's a necessary method for being a modern user researcher. I'm not saying people have to know usability testing to be a user researcher, because not all roles require you to do it. But if you're taking this masterclass, you better bet badass UX leaders do know how to do it. So for reference, I uploaded a YouTube video on usability testing back in 2019. So if you want to watch a younger, better looking, more energetic Kevin without back and knee pain, I invite you to watch that to really let the information sink in. Repetition helps. Repetition helps. Usability testing has its roots in ergonomics in the early 20th century. It's an evaluative research method where we ask participants to complete certain tasks using our product or service. It can help us see how users perform on an interface, uncover problems with design, find out new opportunities to improve, and learn about users' behaviors and preferences. The usability testing is what we do to prevent people from struggle bussing around fax machines, questioning their sanity. It's what we do to save people's lives from dumb design oversights. It's what we do to help our users feel confident and happy. And when we say usability testing, most of the time, people are referring to something called task-based scenarios, which are user goals turned into tasks, and we ask participants to show us how they would complete that task. But believe it or not, there are many kinds of usability tests, some of which you may have heard of before, like the 5-second test, write testing, first click testing, gorilla usability, and quantitative usability testing. So in the following videos, I'll dive deeper into each of these variations, and we'll talk about how we can perform usability tests, whether you choose to do them remotely or in person, moderated or unmoderated, whether you could do them as purely qualitative or comparatively quantitatively. Yes, there is such a thing as quantitative usability testing as well. Looking at the different ways we can conduct usability testing, we can see that we don't just have to pick one way to run it. We can use a combination, mix and match depending on your needs. You can do in-person unmoderated, you can do remote unmoderated, you can do remote moderated. The possibilities are endless. And we should do usability early and often. Usually, we conduct them after a product or concept has been validated, so we can focus on optimizing the experience. Because who cares if people can use something if you don't even know if people will use it in the first place? So don't be fooled. Just because it's evaluative doesn't mean usability testing cannot inspire strategic changes. So here are some common topics that usability testing can help us better understand. We can understand user awareness, user onboarding, if users know something exists or not, whether they perceive some benefit that this feature brings, whether they think the feature might help them. We can also understand desirability. Users choose not to use the feature because they don't value the benefit. We can also understand discoverability. Do they know some feature exists, but they can't find it? And then finally, obviously usability, where people know that a feature exists, they know where to locate it, but it's somehow unusable. As you can see, while some of these areas are usability fixes, some of them require larger strategic efforts too. Now, we learned what usability testing is for. Let's chat about sampling and sample size. We'll learn how to sample for usability tests and what sample size to use. The big question, how many people? So really quickly, let's talk about who to recruit. I would say do not recruit people who are you. What do I mean by that? Don't recruit your teammates, don't recruit yourself, not your grandma, unless your grandma is a target user. Essentially, anyone who knows too much about the product, do not recruit them because you're not gonna learn anything. Recruit your target audience, someone who would be using our product or service. So consider demographics, psychographics, and any specific criteria relevant to your project. So if you're making an app for nurses, you're not going to go and test it with lawyers or construction workers. Also, consider people with accessibility needs too. Get a range of people in your target demographic. For example, for one project, I was studying business owners, entrepreneurs, hiring managers. Basically people who hire others for their business. And I made sure to get a range of ages, gender, business types. I ended up with participants from around the world, from the UK to US, Italy, Kenya, and many other places. But Kevin, what about sample size? Are we supposed to get saturation for each criteria? That's a great question. So let's talk about sample size. You probably heard it before. The magic number 5. 5 participants for usability tests, which can uncover around 80–85% of usability problems. Early 1990s, Robert Verzi and Jacob Nielsen did a lot of studies on how many problems can be caught with a certain number of participants. Now, you've probably heard of the big daddy, Jacob Nielsen from Nielsen Norman Group, but Robert Verzi and Jim Lewis contributed a lot to this magic number 5 as well. And fun fact, when I interviewed with an OG UX research manager, I mentioned Robert Verzi in his paper, and this guy was surprised to hear that I actually read that paper and knew his name, Robert Verzi, since Nielsen wasn't the only one who came up with that sample size of 5. Bonus points. Read that paper, by the way. I'll link a article from Measuring You for you to read. So anyway, 5 users can get us 80% of the problems, and that if we tested more people on the same design, we would get diminishing returns. We're not going to learn much more from the 20th person. And the point of usability testing is that it's quick, it's iterative. The point of it isn't to catch all problems. A better use of resources would be to test with 5 users, catch these major problems, fix them, and then test with a different 5. And in my experience, I'd say it's spot on. 5 is usually enough for one design, but I also like to recruit a few extra between 6 to 8 people. total, just in case somebody doesn't show up, and to have a little bit extra information. Now, I don't know if you caught that just now, what I just said. I said 5 is usually enough for one design. Why? Because it's also important to consider how many prototypes you're testing. Because if you're testing more than one, we need to consider whether to do this within subjects or between subjects. And that can affect our sample size as well. But what if instead of multiple prototypes, we had multiple criteria? Now for my study, I got 5 participants total. I think it was 6 or something. But each person was from a different country, the US, Italy, Kenya, Singapore, etc. Is that important? Do we need 5 from each country or just 5 total? That's a good question, my friend. I had a question like this myself too. And we have to ask ourselves, do we care about saturation for certain criteria, or do we just care about finding usability issues? So it depends on our goals. The classic, it depends answer. When it comes to usability testing, a total of 5 target users should do the trick. Now, if you have a strong hypothesis that user needs in the UK are going to be drastically different from user needs in Kenya, then you might need a separate study to localize and design accordingly for your users. So sample size for usability testing, 5 should do it, but practically speaking, I think between 6 to 8 is okay. So in short, recruit your target users and a minimum size of 5 should do the trick. Have you ever done any online shopping only to be confused by their categories on the website? Oh my gosh. The organization or categorization of items is called information architecture, IA for short, not AI, IA. And in this lesson, we're going to be talking about card sorting and information architecture, what it is, how we conduct it, and how to analyze it with or without software. Yes, without software. Let's get started. Let's go! To find out how things should be organized, we conduct something called an open card sort study. And card sorting is when you give users cards of the items that have them and arrange them in a certain way that makes sense to them, which helps make navigating your product more intuitive. Just like how you might sort your clothes for laundry, or how you like your spice rack to be arranged. Whatever the case, the point is we all group things into groups that make sense to us. And if people aren't able to easily find things on your website because maybe we've haphazardly put menu items all over the place, then it's not a good time. So we use card sorting to identify how we should group things together more intuitively. At times, you might do a heuristic evaluation or just look at the dang thing and realize that it's harder to navigate around the site than you thought. Or users may tell you that they're going to the wrong places, or it's just hard to find something. Or we can check analytics and see that users are spending a long time finding what they need on your website. All of these are possible signals that our website ain't too organized. Oftentimes, we might even identify that it's not the navigation itself that's confusing, but the jargon and copy that we use could be confusing to users as well. So a card sort task can help us organize a website and gather some comprehension on certain words. There are different ways we can run a card sort. We can run it open or closed. We can do it in person with physical cards or digitally online. We can choose to moderate it or go unmoderated. And I'll discuss a variation called the Delphi card sort. So let's talk about the open versus closed card sorts first. Open card sorts are used to develop a new information architecture. What we do is give participants the cards without any order and have them arrange them. And the task we would give is basically organize these into groups that make sense to you. Pretty easy. And a closed card sort, we already have predefined categories or spaces. So we use this method to validate an existing information architecture and see where people might organize things underneath our predefined categories. And the task we would give them is simply organize the cards into the groups you see here. And that's the main difference between an open and a closed card sort. So why ever do a closed card sort? Well, for example, one project I did at Google had both open and closed elements to it. We wanted to find out how to organize our menu options for our smartwatch product. In this case, which card sort would you use, open or closed? I would use an open card sort. But another research question that we had from the study, the designer had, was which menu options should be on the phone and which one should be on the smartwatch and which one should be on both devices. In this case, we do a closed card sort because we had 3 predefined options already, phone, smartwatch, and both. Well, With that quick intro to card sorting, let's head over to the next lesson where we'll talk about moderated versus unmoderated card sorts, sample size, how many cards you should have, and how to actually conduct one. To moderate or not moderate? That is the question.
What kind of stupid-ass question is that?
Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to probe and ask why, or to take our sort online to provide higher power for analysis. Shakespeare wrote that. I'm just kidding. Let's talk about the pros and cons of moderated card sorts versus unmoderated cards. So moderated studies, we get to probe and ask why as the participants sort their cards. We know that. We have the ability to troubleshoot and help them out if they get stuck, and we have more control over the situation to gather the data that we need. Of course, with any moderated studies, we'd have to spend time moderating and scheduling people. Common pros and cons of moderated studies. Unmoderated studies, we can use certain tools online and have participants do the card sort on their own time, thus saving us time. So in a way, a pro is that we don't have to moderate, although that's also the con, where we're unable to probe or ask why for certain items. Sure, we can provide open-ended comment boxes for people, but if you have 60 or more cards, I can assure you they ain't gonna do that. They're gonna comment on the most prominent ones, which is still helpful, but they're not gonna comment on every single card. If you're able to get folks to think aloud during the card sort, that's great. Sample size, let's talk about that. I think you can get away with fewer participants for a moderated study because you're able to probe deeper into the rationale. A good number could be between 10 to 15. For unmoderated studies, according to Jeff Sorrow and Tom Tellis, the sample size can range from 20 or more than 30 participants to give us enough power for analysis. For safe reasons, I would go for 30. Central limit theorem, minimum sample size of 30 if you're gonna go unmoderated. And if you're gonna moderate it, 10 to 15 people, I think. So, another question is, how many cards do we give participants? Should we give them everything we have, every single item? What if we have like 100 items, 100 cards? Well, if you're conducting this in person, I'd say anywhere from 30 to 60 cards is a good number to have. People might fatigue if you give them more. Have fewer cards here because it's more cognitively taxing. If you're gonna have more cards, make sure to give people breaks. Now, if you're conducting this online, anywhere between 30 to 80 cards is okay. Now, some articles say you can go up to 100 cards, but I'll say this. If you have 100 cards, why do you have 100 cards to begin with? That's a lot. That's a lot of menu options. Yeah, sure, you maybe have a complex website. We need to trim it down, speak to our stakeholders, see which one we know for sure we keep and which ones are not that important to know about. There may be cards already that you know where to place them. So maybe you don't give all of them to users, or you can split them into two separate studies, or you can kind of mix and match groups of users with certain groups of cards so they don't have to be fatigued. Speaking of digital, I'll mention a few tools that you can use for online card sorting. The most popular one being Optimal Sort from Optimal Workshop. UX Tweak also has it, Web Sort also has it. There's a lot of tools with this ability. Some tools have free capacity, or after a certain amount of cards, you'll need to pay. If you're totally on a budget and want to hack your way through it for free, you can use something like Trello, something where you can just drag and drop cards. Miro can even work for this. Google Jamboard, if anyone uses that. So anyway, here's 5 easy steps on how to conduct a card sort. Step 1, prepare the cards on your tool or table if you're doing it in person. Label them with numbers so you can refer back to them easily, and also have some blank cards as well. So that's the setup. Step 2 is instruct participants to think aloud and then rearrange until they're satisfied. If they are unsure, we can probe and ask why, and then we can note down what was confusing. We can also let them know that they can put cards aside in a separate pile if nothing makes sense to them for now. If they think something is missing, that's what the blank cards are for. They can create their own using those blank cards. So while they're conducting, we're gonna observe them, we're gonna note down, and ideally we would record their progression. Step 3, after our participant finishes, take a look at the groups they formed. How many groups did they form? And ask them the rationale. If it looks like there's too many groups, ask if any can be combined. If there's too few groups, ask if any could be separated. Step 4, have participants label their groups. They probably already did this in their minds, but this is just formality. Have them actually name it. And finally, step 5, take a photo. or screenshot of their groupings. You could try this on your own too. Just go to any website of your choice. Your friend's website, Trader Joe's, Best Choice Market, HEB, and look at their navigation menu. Write down all their sub-menus on the cards and ignore their initial categories. Then have a few friends or participants to try this with. Who knows? You might even find some awesome improvements to the navigation. And you know what? Here's a secret pro tip for you. You don't have to sort just words. You can also sort images or icons onto a page. For example, you can provide an empty wireframe to participants and give them icons, images, even entire sections to sort out. See how creative we can get with our methods? In a way, this is kind of like co-design exercise, but it is related to information architecture and hierarchy and how things are organized. So you can also do it with images. So that's how not to do field research. Field research itself is an umbrella term because it can refer to an amalgam of methods such as observation, contextual inquiry, and diary studies. I like to point out something that might sound controversial though. UX researchers often say they do ethnography as a form of field research. Ethno, its Greek root for ethnos, which means people nation. Graphy is study of. To all the anthropologists or social scientists out there, I apologize on behalf of user researchers who say we do ethnography. We do not do true ethnography. We do ethnographic research in the form of contextual inquiry or observation, but not true ethnography. Ethnography is the study of people's cultures, customs, and behaviors over an extended period of time. An anthropologist might even live with the people for years to get all of the nuances and dynamics of everyday life, or dress up as a zebra and experience what it's like to be in the plains of Africa. Lion meat. What we user researchers do, in fact, is observe participants in the wild, in their natural environments, but we're usually doing it no longer than a few hours or a few days at most. And the scope is much more focused on certain user goals or experiences within particular contexts. And that's the difference. Now, for the purpose of this lesson, we're going to talk about specifically contextual inquiry. Now, throughout the next few video lessons, I'll break down the steps to plan, conduct contextual inquiry, along with who we recruit, where to go, a bunch of logistics, and how to involve our stakeholders. Contextual inquiry is the most common form of ethnographic field research, where we combine observation with interviews in order to observe participants' behaviors in context. Examples can include going to people's homes, their office space, going to a hospital to research healthcare professionals, manufacturing plants to observe inefficiencies or efficiencies, and many, many possibilities. The word inquiry literally means the act of asking questions, which to me is the interview portion of contextual inquiry. Now combine observation with interviews, and we have contextual inquiry. Voila! We know what interviews are. What's observation? Nice. Observation is a classic research methodology. It could also be called fly-on-the-wall observation, where we observe people in their natural environment. Most of the time, we might not interact with the subjects at all. Kind of like creeping on people. Example, you want to see how people move through a subway station, or count how many people use their vehicle turn signals, or how people greet each other in different cultures. Another field research technique is going undercover as a user and seeing how people interact with us. This is supposed to be a mustache. I forgot to bring one. Anyway, these going undercover studies are called mystery shopper studies or service safaris. What happens is we pretend to be a customer and ask questions about the product to staff or customer support.
Alternatively, you can ask questions to other customers and learn about their decision-making processes in purchasing or not. Now, we discussed the ethics of this research method back in an earlier module, and since it's not instilling any harm on participants, this is fine to do. Now, with this method, mystery shopping, we can look out for opportunities for improvement in the service process, knowledge of customer support agents, and you can compare it to other stores. Also, other things that a shopper would experience.
So we talked about what contextual inquiry is. How about when do we do contextual inquiry? Well, we can do it if the team is struggling to find the root causes for a problem that your product is supposed to solve. We also do contextual inquiry when we want to learn more about the user's contexts for tasks, unmet needs, or to test your product in the wild. I'm in the wild suburbs. These are great times for contextual inquiry to understand the foundation of what our users are doing and provide us with more reliable sources of truth when the team begins brainstorming solutions. Yay, we finally get to talk about my favorite research method, diary studies. Mainly because I love snooping around my brother's diary as a kid. Just kidding, I don't have a brother.
Ha! Gotcha.
But it is my favorite method because it's just so versatile in how we can really get creative with how we conduct it. Diary studies aren't just run one way. In this section, we'll talk about what diary studies are, how to conduct one, the pros and cons, and I'll share 2 really in-depth case studies with you from my days at Google and Uber, where I use this method. Diary studies, also known as cultural probes, are a great substitute for field research. It's a longitudinal method where we can ask participants to keep a diary of their day-to-day lives to capture attitudes and behaviors over a period of time. And that's what longitudinal means, over a period of time. And we can run a diary study for as long or as short as we want, from a few days to even years. Now, when might we do diary studies? When might we want to use it? Well, to find out user motivations behind their behaviors in context. Understand how small actions over time affect larger decisions and why. We could also see how people approach their goals in different ways and get really rich data about it. We can also learn how experiences change over time, whether it's learning a new tool or something else. We can learn about things that people don't normally do and why. Why not? Diary studies are very useful to help us find out about, for example, your current product or prototypes. We can send people your product or prototype and have them interact with them over time. We can also learn about general behavior and activities, understand what and how people do things in different contexts, specific activities or tasks. We can understand how people do certain things like buying a flight ticket, what goes into buying a flight ticket, not just the act of buying a flight ticket, but what comes before and after, over time. What's their emotions? Also ordering delivery or how they achieve their personal goals. Very foundational use cases for diary studies. Now, how do we conduct one? Like I mentioned, there's many different ways you can conduct it. I'll go really in depth with 2 case studies so you can see that there's a variety of ways that you can conduct a diary study. But let's get the basics down first. What's the first step in every research study? That's right. And this is automatic for you now. Step 0 is defining the objectives and research questions. Picking good participants is also crucial. So get your target criteria and recruit a diverse sample. Then figure out our stimulus for the question that we have at hand, your product or service or understanding, and send your participants if you have something that you need to send them. And finally, figure out how often you want your participants to do your diary. Is it daily, at the beginning or end of the day, every 2 hours, or do you want to fill a diary study only after a certain trigger or a specific event? This is something you have to decide based on your research goals. After that, I highly suggest bookending our diary study with in-depth interviews, meaning start the study off with a user interview, then off they go, diary study in between, and then we can close the diary study off with kind of what we call an exit interview, a final exit interview. That I find is the best way to let participants know that there's a human being on the other side willing to help you, as well as recapping the study once you're done. And I don't do my diary studies without those 2 interviews at the end. And lastly, let's talk about the pros and cons of this diary method. Pros,
everything. Cons, nothing, because I love diary studies. I'm not biased at all. I'm just kidding.
I'm kidding. Who am I?
The pros. When you go do field studies and you're observing someone, you may unintentionally come across the Hawthorne effect. But here with the diary study, we minimize that Hawthorne effect because we're not actually observing them. We don't look over their shoulders and watch them. We can be when and where your participants are without actually having to be there, which is a really strong advantage of diary studies. It's a very efficient way to collect data on natural behavior and see trends over time in different contexts. And as we'll see soon, it's so versatile and you can use it with really adaptive methods. Not to mention that it is a good alternative to field studies. Now, while the pros are amazing, I do have to admit there may be some cons to this favorite method of mine. It is pretty time and money intensive. You can't do a diary study in one day. I mean, you could, but you won't get much data that way. And the point of diary studies, you have to remember that the advantage of doing diary studies so that you can see behaviors and attitudes, trends over time. And one day isn't a lot of time for you to see any trends, even 2 days. So you really got to think about how long you want to do your diary study for. But anyway, it is time intensive in that aspect. Diary studies are also based on self-report, which may elicit inaccurate data because people might only report things that they think are interesting and omit things that they think are not interesting, in which case there are workarounds. This is the crux of user research in general. We see and report what we see and what we hear, but it's also important to read between the lines.
Read between the lines.
What aren't people saying? What aren't people doing? And that's when we have to ask follow-up questions. That's the workaround. Now, one common con or disadvantage of diary studies is that researchers might say, but you can't observe behavior directly. In my next couple videos, I'll show you how exactly I got around that con by using body cameras or video vlogs. Video vlogs? Video logs, vlogs. One really major con of the diary study method is attrition rates or drop-off rates. Because the longer you study, the more people that are going to drop out of your study. We can shorten the study, focus it a little bit more, or provide some milestones for incentives to keep them engaged. This one we're going to talk about between versus within subjects design.
Let's go!
If you're planning a usability test with 2 prototypes, we could do several things. 1, test each prototype independently with different participants. Or 2, test both prototypes with the same participant. Now, if you're testing them independently, this is something called between subjects design. Participants are seeing both prototypes. This is called within subjects. Just for funnies, I'm gonna throw more jargony confusion at you, because I want you to suffer. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
It's because I want to prepare you for the real world, which consists of people using way too many terms for the same thing. And that's why you're taking this class, so I can cut the BS. So here goes. Between subjects design is also known as between groups or independent measures. Within subjects is also known as within groups or repeated measures. Now, for the purpose of this masterclass, and honestly, let's make the world a simpler place by using the same term, I'm gonna stick with using the words between and within subjects. Since they're dense words and people always get them mixed up like me, I came up with some terrible analogies to help you remember which one's which. For between subjects, remember, between subjects is when participants independently experience your conditions separately, right? Let's say you have 2 prototypes, one person takes a prototype and another person takes the other prototype. Each person does not see both. So anyway, within subjects design, I like to imagine a river that's in between 2 lovers standing across from each other. The lovers never interact because they're separated by a river that's in between them. Hashtag sad story.
Hashtag get better hashtags.
I told you these are dumb. Now for within subjects design, all right, this is when
Participants experience multiple treatments or conditions, or prototypes in that case. Imagine you have multiple superpowers within yourself, which you all do. You get to activate all of them. That's the power within. So go forth, badass UX leader. Unleash all your powers.
With great power comes great responsibility.
I hope it helps, because I always forget, like, oh, is between subjects the one where they do both, or anyway. Between subjects, something comes in between them, prevents people from interacting with another thing. Within subjects, you have multiple powers within you. You get to use them all, okay? So those are my analogies. I don't know, right? If you can come up with a better way to remember, I'm all for it. Kevin, is one design better than the other? Is within subjects or between subjects better? Ah, well, I'm glad you asked, young Padawan. Anytime we ask if something's better than another, expect a conversation about pros and cons. Let's break it down then. Between subject studies, the pros are there are no order effects, learning or fatigue effects. That might bias the second condition. And what I mean by that is, if you're doing a between subject, that means participants are only seeing one variation, and they only see one variation. So they don't get tired, you don't get any order effects. Order effects meaning one variation affects the perception of another. Since they're only seeing one, you don't get that. Shorter sessions, that's another pro, because people only see one. Third, between subject studies are kind of easier to set up, because you only have to set up one thing. You don't have to worry about order effects. Now, the cons of between subjects are that you may need a larger sample size, because participants only see one condition. If you want enough power or statistical significance to compare these two groups, if multiple variations, then you need a larger sample size. Another con is that there may be individual differences that may affect the result. Of course, there's always individual differences, but they may be a little bit more pronounced when you're comparing one variation to another. Since we identified the cons of between subjects, there are ways around those cons. The best way to resolve the cons is randomly assigning participants to your conditions. Okay, so let's say you have two prototypes. You just randomly assign your participants to either version A or version B. Randomly assign them. Because now those individual differences are not the result of the condition, but since you randomly assign them. So let's talk about the pros and cons of within subject studies. For within subject designs, the pros are that individual differences are reduced because the same participant is seeing all the versions. Okay, so if one person's really interesting with one variation, you can see their behavior reflected with all of the variations. So the individual differences aren't as pronounced. Within subjects designs, another pro is that you don't need as large of a sample size because they get to see all the conditions. Right? You don't have to pay more people to see the variations. You could just pay fewer people to see all the variations. Random noise is reduced. It's kind of related to individual differences. And finally, you can compare data within the designs. Okay, that's one thing you cannot do with between subjects, is that you can get comparison data, right? Within subjects, participants get to see more versions. Naturally, they're going to be like, well, compared to this one, it's blah, blah, blah. In between subjects, participants only see one version. They have nothing to compare it to. So you have no comparison data. So those are the pros of within subjects. The cons, okay, there's always pros and cons. Since you have to, there's no way a participant is physically able to see all variations without being affected by a different one, okay? And the way you present, the order in which you present them may bias participants. So you see version A, and then they see version B. They're gonna compare it to version A. So this is known as order effects. The order of the conditions can, and they may affect their behavior. The performance also may be better because either, the order effects can come in many flavors, okay? It could be fatigue, right? I'm seeing 1 version, 2 version, 3 versions, so on. I'm gonna get tired. And maybe by the 5th version, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm like, oh, I'm bored. I don't want to see anymore. Right? Another thing another order effect flavor is that maybe by the 5th version, they get really good at the task that you presented them. For example, they've gotten practice by then. They could be fatigued. They could get better. They could be tired. So all of these are related to order effects, and that's one major con to the within subjects design. However, like I mentioned, with any con, there are workarounds, right? That's nice to know. In life, when going gets tough, there's always a way. Now, the way around that con for within subjects is something called counterbalancing. We can counterbalance the order that participants see a particular design. Counterbalancing. If you've never heard of this word, that's all right. We're going to talk about it in the next lesson.
Alrighty then.
So, as you can see, to answer your question, little Padawan, neither design is better than the other because it depends on what your goals are. It's great that there are ways to resolve the issues with both experimental designs, but what the heck is randomization? What's counterbalancing? Another great question, lovely Padawan researcher. See, there's so much to think about when planning research, right? Oh, what are we measuring? What are we manipulating? Do I get comparison data, or do I want to have task times? Do I want to focus on one variation? Do I want them to see all variations? And if I want them to see all variations, how do I get rid of that order effect?
Please stop!
This is the rigor that goes into research planning. And y'all are on the way to being badass UX researchers by knowing this. So with that, let's dive into counterbalancing and randomization. If we have 8 participants and 3 prototypes, we can't just show the prototypes in the same order for everyone.
We can't!
If everybody sees version 1 first, that will introduce order effects and affect the validity of our results. Because maybe version 1 affects how a user uses version 2 and so on. Or maybe people just get tired over time and perform worse on version 3. Whatever the reason for order effects, we must consider this order effect in which you show something to participants. Now, to reduce order effects and the influence of these extraneous variables, it's another vocab word I want you to look up, extraneous variables. So to reduce these order effects, we can do something called counterbalancing or randomization of the order in which we show the stimulus. It's really easy when you have 2 stimuli or designs. Okay, let's start with that example, 2 designs.
Let's do it!
For participant 1, actually, let me use these little buddies. It's really easy if you have 2 stimuli or designs. Let's call them A and B. And let's say we have 6 participants here. Okay, so A and B. For participant 1, we can show design A and then B. Okay, so pretty easy, right? For second participant, we could just switch up the order. B first and then A. Participant 3, switch the order. Switch it back, easy peasy.
Lemon squeezy.
All right, so that's pretty easy. 2 designs, just switch them back and forth, or you could even do this. AB, 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 and for these participants, BA, BA, BA. In practical terms, I would switch them up every participant just because, maybe you do A and B first day of your study, and then see B and A for the second day. I'd like to see a low variation of both, just so I could tell my stakeholders, or at least share with my stakeholders, hey, there's some interesting things and it has nothing to do with the order effects. But it doesn't really matter. As long as at the end of the study, you got both counterbalances. Now, 2 designs, 2 stimuli. Very easy, right? Just switch it up. But what if you had 3 designs, A, B, and C? So participant 1, easy, right? Design A, design B, then design C. Oh, it's getting harder, you see, right? A, B, C. Now, what order should participant 2 be? Ooh. Participant 2, what order should that be? Well, we could do design B first, move this to the top. Yeah, this is hard. And then C, and then A, to the last one. Yeah, this works. What would you do for third participant? Okay. Ooh, yeah, how about this? We can move the orders up again. Design C, then A, then B. Whoa. Now, what about the fourth participant? How about we start over with ABC? That makes sense, right? And if we repeat the treatment orders like this, ABC, BCA, CAB, and then restart, this is what's known as the Latin square design. But we want to avoid the Latin square. Why is that? Here's the problem with the Latin square. A always comes before B, and B always comes before C, and so on. So inherently, the Latin square still has order effects. So what do we do instead? Let's do some quick maths. We're gonna do some factorial combinations here.
2 plus 2 is 4, minus 1, that's 3, quick maths.
Please ignore the old markers because I haven't used this in a while and it's all solidified on there. So for n number of prototypes, we find out how many possible order combinations there could be. This is called n factorial. So the factorial, this exclamation mark, just means you're going to multiply all the numbers with that digit. So for example, if you have 3 factorial, it's 1 times 2 times 3. This gives us 6. 6 possible combinations for having 3 prototypes.
So easy.
Okay, right? So let's try that. A, B, C, B, C, A, C, A, B. We did this before. Now, what are the other 3? Because the factorial only tells you how many possible combinations there are, but it doesn't actually tell you what the combinations actually are. So let's try this. ABC, BCA, CAB, ACB. Let's switch these around. BAC and CBA. And those are the 6 possible combinations that you can have if you had 3 prototypes. Let's try it with 4. I don't think I could write every one of them out, but 4 times 4. This gives us 24. 24 combinations. Now, I ain't got time to write out 24 of these combinations. We got the first 6. If you want to find out the other 18, be my guest. But the good thing is, you probably won't be testing with 24 participants, nor should you be testing with 4 prototypes anyway. And honestly, whenever I do prototype testing, I always ask my stakeholders to limit their choices down to 3 maximum. Now, if you want to pseudo-randomize assigning people to conditions, here are the steps to do so. First is to find out n factorial, to find out how many order combinations you have. Then, you write down the combinations, and then 3, randomly assign an order to your participants. I call it pseudo-random because we still have some power over it. It's not true random. That's more like if you majored in math, you'll know what true random means. To find a random number, you can use a function in Google Sheets with this formula. Equals rand between your low number and your high number. Your low is 1 and the high is n factorial. Stanford University, 1971, where one of the most notorious experiments in modern psychology took place. Professor Philip Zimbardo attempted to study the effects of perceived power between prison guards and prisoners, but really the overarching question was, does the external situation outside of your control dictate your behavior? Or do the intrinsic morals of your being allow you to rise above those negative environments? What happens when you place somebody in a place of power? So college student participants were randomly assigned to be either a prison guard or prisoner. And for the next 14 days, the guards and the prisoners would assume their roles, unsure of the impact that the study would have on their psyche later. The prisoners were made to do push-ups, they were beaten, they were humiliated, and other psychological torture. Guards would do this naturally, or by the instruction from Zimbardo. Yes, the professor, the scientist, actually intervened and instructed the guards to amp up their harshness. So if demand characteristics were a thing, it would be this study. A few days into the study, the prisoner participants would demand to withdraw from the study, but they weren't allowed to. What started off as a study began to muddle into the unknown. Even the professor didn't see what was happening. A study that was supposed to go for 14 days stopped just after 6. And that's only because Zimbardo's wife told them to stop. Fun fact, I ran into Zimbardo in the Stanford restroom before. I didn't talk to him in there or anything. Just 10 years earlier, in 1961, a Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram conducted another notorious study, what will be known as the Milgram experiment. So he wanted to study to the extent to which people would obey authority. The experimenter would sit in a room with the participant while a fake test subject sat in another room separated by a wall. Now, the fake test subject was someone who was in on the study. The participant was told that they would have to shock the student as they answered quiz questions. Now, the student, or the fake test subject, would pretend to answer quiz questions wrong, in which case the participant was told to shock them, and they would have to increase the voltage the more they got wrong, and the test subject on the other side of the wall was instructed to scream. Now, these screams were fake because the test subject was just pretending to feel the pain. But the participant didn't know that. They thought they were actually shocking people, and they would question the researcher. They would want to stop, but the researcher would urge them to keep going sometimes. Keep shocking them! Sometimes administering fatal levels of electricity, to the point where the test subject would stop screaming, so the participant thought they passed out, or worse. So why do I share these two stories with you? Well, because in the first study, participants wanted to stop, but they weren't allowed to. And the participants were not debriefed until years after the experiment was finished. There's a lack of informed consent because they didn't know what was involved in the study. And finally, there were demand characteristics where guards would act the way that the researcher wanted them to act, which ain't badass research to me. That's just bad research. In the second experiment, the Milgram experiment, participants were exposed to extreme emotional stress and inflicted insight, where a participant realizes a deep flaw about themselves. And despite fully informed consent, the experimenter didn't ensure the well-being of the participants. I'll leave you with one more example that was a bit more recent. In 2014, Facebook ran a massive psychological experiment on 700,000 users without them knowing. They manipulated people's news feeds to either contain more or less negative content and assess whether that affects people's emotions. Any lab could tell you that, oh duh, of course it does. Why do you need to run a study to find this? Just do some secondary research. Like, what was the point of this study? Anyway, these stories show the dark side of research and how it should not be done. We must learn to recognize what is bad research, not just protect ourselves, but our team, our company, and above all, our users. Let's learn how to keep our users safe and secure by conducting research responsibly. Ethics are a set of moral principles to help us function for the greater good of society, and in the case of UX research, the safety and well-being of our customers. We're the Jedi of the UX universe with the force of good. I couldn't find a lightsaber, so this is it. Why do we need ethics though? Apart from defeating unethical Sith Lords, to promote truth by prohibiting the falsifying or misrepresentation of data, uphold respect, health, well-being, and safety of people, and to protect your ass, your company's ass, and our users' entire being. If you come from academic research, you'll be familiar with the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. Biomedical human behavior research in academia, IRBs exist to ensure research methods are ethical. Their job is to analyze the risk-benefit of studies and determine what to approve or reject. They make sure appropriate steps are taken to protect the rights and welfare of human participants. Many people ask what resources there are to learn about research ethics, and unless they come from an academic research background, most UX researchers don't know because nobody teaches this stuff. So I'm gonna teach you some today. The Belmont Report, 1974, was created because of an infamous study called the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, which involved recruiting Black Americans to study syphilis and test out different treatments on them. It was a cruel study, and it's the reason why we have strict ethical principles for research today. The Belmont Report would eventually be replaced by the American Psychological Association's Ethical Principles of Psychological and Code of Conduct. Oh my goodness.
Oh my goodness.
Long name, I know. And in summary, there are 5 golden rules: respect for personas, beneficence, justice, fidelity and responsibility, integrity. So let's talk about each one. Respect for personas means we protect the autonomy of all people and treat them with courtesy and respect, and allowing informed consent. We must be truthful and debrief participants if we ever use deception. Beneficence means do no harm, while maximizing benefits for the research project and minimizing risk to the participant. Justice means we ensure reasonable, non-exploitative, and well-considered research procedures that are administered fairly and equally, the fair distribution of costs and benefits to potential participants. Fidelity and responsibility refers to establishing trust for the study and taking responsibility for any repercussions that may occur. And last but not least, integrity. I've had a manager who used to omit bad data to make herself look good. Well, all that does is hurt the users in the end.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I think I kind of had that coming.
Don't be like her. Ensure honesty and accuracy with all your activities. Is not about you. It's about your stakeholders. It's about the users, which again, I mentioned again and again, without users, we don't have a business. So we better be good to them. We must follow these guidelines. This isn't a choice. We have to. This may be new to some of you, so keep this close, print this out, and frame it on your wall. That's how important this is. And I just hope more UX researchers will treat this as part of the core curriculum of being a researcher.